Welcome to the deep dive. If you are joining us today, you are likely, well, you're probably looking at your news feeds, looking at the markets, and feeling that very familiar sense of information overload.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere today.
Right. You're seeing headlines that feel completely disconnected from one another, yet somehow they're all terrifying at the exact same time.
Ugh,
So consider us your knowledgeable friends. We are here to help you cut through that noise.
that's right.
We take the massive stack of breaking reports, official statements, and analyst transcripts, and we
Yeah.
distill them down so you can step into your day fully informed.
And I have to say, we have an incredibly dense stack of material today. I mean, we are looking at a geopolitical chessboard that has effectively been flipped over overnight.
Yeah, flipped over is putting it mildly.
Exactly. The situation is moving blisteringly fast, touching almost every corner of the global stage. It involves military strategy, yes, but it immediately bleeds into global economics, international diplomacy, and a very sudden and honestly very dramatic shift in leadership within a major regional power.
So let's ground ourselves. Today is Monday, March 9, 2026, and the mission for this deep dive is to understand a massive, multi-layered escalation in the Middle East. It's a situation that is already sending absolute shockwaves into global markets, and it really feels like the old rule books are just being thrown out the window in real time.
They really are. I mean, nothing is playing out the way traditional models would predict.
Right. We are looking at wide-scale military strikes across multiple areas. We are tracking crude oil surging past $100 a barrel. We're watching a brand new leader who's immediately been forced underground just to survive.
Which is unprecedented in itself.
Yeah. And perhaps most chillingly, we have analysts pointing to a vision for what they are calling a Shiite North Korea. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the tactical ground game because the sheer scale of the military operations happening right now it's just staggering.
It is.
The reports are describing Israel's actions as a wide-scale wave of strikes targeting regime infrastructure across three distinct areas in Iran.
The terminology there is crucial. A wide-scale wave is military shorthand for an operation that requires immense, I mean, truly immense logistical coordination.
Because it's not just a couple of drones.
Oh, no, no. You do not hit three geographically distinct areas inside a massive country like Iran without utilizing multiple squadrons, electronic warfare aircraft to blind their radar, mid-air refueling, and a highly synchronized command and control structure.
Right.
And they are targeting regime infrastructure, which is, a broad term, but it implies they are not just going after isolated missile launchers out in the desert somewhere. They are systematically dismantling the physical apparatus that allows the state's military and internal security forces to actually function.
But the reality of an operation that massive is that it rarely stays neatly within the borders of the intended target.
Rarely, almost never.
The geographical boundaries of this conflict are essentially evaporating before our eyes. We are seeing immediate regional spillover, and the incidents being reported are the kind that keep national security advisors awake for weeks. For instance, we have reports that NATO air defenses in Turkey actually had to shoot down an Iranian missile that entered Turkish airspace.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a missile entering the airspace of a NATO member like Turkey is a textbook example of extreme volatility.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with munitions crossing into the territory of a military alliance that operates on the principle of collective defense, the margin for error drops to absolute zero.
Stop right there, because that is a massive point. We always hear about NATO and collective defense, but what does that actually mean in the control room? Like, when a radar operator in Turkey sees an Iranian missile tracking across their screen, what happens?
It means they have seconds, literally seconds, to make a decision that could theoretically pull 32 nations into a war. NATO's foundational treaty includes Article 5, which states that an armed attack against one member is considered an attack against them all. Now, an errant missile crossing a border is usually treated as a spillover event, rather than a deliberate declaration of war against the entire alliance.
Right. Nobody thinks Iran is intentionally trying to start World War III with Turkey in the middle of this.
Exactly. But the air defense commanders on the ground, they cannot afford to assume it is just an accident. They have to intercept it. And the sheer kinetic reality of shooting down a ballistic or cruise missile over sovereign territory means debris is falling, tensions are spiking, and encrypted lines to Brussels are immediately lighting up.
It's just chaos.
It illustrates just how easily a targeted strike in one nation can ripple outward, forcing neighboring countries to actively deploy their own weapons.
And it is not just Turkey. We're seeing Gulf nations also reporting their own overnight attacks. The entire region is lighting up, and the containment lines we've relied on for years are just fraying badly.
The Gulf nations reporting attacks overnight reinforces the vulnerability of the entire regional architecture. You have some of the most concentrated energy infrastructure on the planet sitting right across the Persian Gulf from Iran.
Literally a stone's throw away in geopolitical terms.
Exactly. When the airspace becomes this contested, every single commercial flight, every oil tanker, and every desalination plant in the region is suddenly operating in an active conflict zone.
As if that broader regional chaos wasn't complicated enough, we have a very specific, highly controversial incident that has surfaced within the last few hours. There is new video that appears to confirm a United States airstrike targeted a naval base. But the critical, complicating detail here is that this naval base is located right next to an Iranian school.
Yeah, the school strike incident. As it's being referred to, it immediately brings the realities of urban warfare and dual-use infrastructure into very sharp focus. When you situate military assets, like a working naval base, immediately adjacent to civilian infrastructure like a school, any kinetic action becomes an absolute nightmare regarding collateral damage. And of course, the subsequent battle over the narrative.
And that battle over the narrative is happening right now in Washington. The messaging is deeply fractured, and as we look at the official responses, we need to simply lay out what is being said impartially, because the contrast is stark.
It really is two completely different approaches.
Exactly. On one hand, you have the current Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, stating that the U.S. is still investigating the incident.
And that is the standard institutional posture of the Pentagon. When video footage surfaces, especially in the fog of war where deepfakes or misattributed footage are rampant, the Department of Defense will always hold its cards close to the chest.
They don't want to say anything. They have to walk back later.
Right. They wait for their internal battle damage assessments, satellite imagery, and intelligence intercepts to confirm exactly what ordnance was dropped, where it landed, and who was actually in the vicinity.
Right. It is the cautious approach. But then you have President Donald Trump taking a completely different rhetorical path. He has bypassed that cautious institutional language entirely and cast the blame for the incident directly on Iran.
Yes.
So you have the defense secretary signaling an ongoing fact-finding investigation, while the commander-in-chief is already assigning ultimate culpability to the adversary for placing a military asset near a civilian center.
It really highlights the immense complexity of controlling a narrative in real time. One leader is speaking to the legal and operational realities of a specific strike, while the other is speaking to the broader strategic and political blame game. It is a dense, tragic situation on the ground that instantly becomes a political football globally.
But the shockwaves of this tactical ground game are not just military, and they are not just political. They are deeply economic.
Oh, mass.
We've seen how this volatility is threatening airspace and civilian centers. But the real, tangible impact for you listening, the thing that brings a conflict thousands of miles away right to your front door, is hitting the trading floors this morning. Oil has just surged past $100 per barrel. That is a 4-year high.
The $100 mark is a massive psychological and economic threshold. It is not just a number on a ticker, it is an alarm bell that rings across every major economy.
Because it touches everything.
Everything. When oil breaches triple digits, it instantly increases the cost of manufacturing, shipping, agriculture, everyday transportation. The inflationary pressure is immediate.
And we are already seeing the operational panic that drives those prices up. Bahrain's national oil company has officially declared force majeure due to the ongoing threat to its energy sites. Now, for anyone who hasn't spent time buried in international trade contracts, force majeure is essentially the ultimate legal ripcord.
It's the act of God clause.
Right. It essentially means an unforeseeable, unavoidable event, like the extreme hazards of a regional war, prevents a party from fulfilling its contractual obligations.
It is a legal shield, but to the global commodities market, it is a giant red flag.
Yeah, they don't see the legal protection, they just see the panic.
Exactly. When a national oil company invokes force majeure, they are broadcasting to the world. The physical danger to our pipelines, our refineries, and our ports is so severe that we cannot guarantee our supply chains will hold. The market hears that, assumes a massive drop in global supply is imminent, and prices skyrocket purely based on that fear.
Which perfectly explains why the global financial leadership is scrambling. Today, there was a virtual meeting held in Brussels by the G7 finance ministers. And the guest list for this meeting reads like an alphabet soup of the world's financial guardians.
It really does.
You had the heads of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the International Energy Agency, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development all on the exact same call.
Having all of those heavy hitters in one virtual room tells you everything you need to know about the severity of the situation. They were meeting specifically to discuss a potential joint release of strategic oil reserves.
To flood the market.
Exactly. The goal would be to flood the market with millions of barrels of emergency crude to artificially increase supply and cool down these surging prices before they wreck the global economy.
But, and this is the crucial takeaway from Brussels, no decision was made. They met, they discussed the crisis, but they kept the emergency reserves locked up. We have a very revealing quote from France's economy and finance minister, Roland Lescure. When he was asked by reporters if the United States had agreed to release its oil stockpiles, his response was simply, "We're not there yet."
We're not there yet. It is a carefully calibrated diplomatic phrase.
Very careful.
Lescure elaborated, saying they agreed to use any necessary tools to stabilize the market, including potential stockpile releases, and that work will continue over the next couple of days. But he gave a very specific reason for their hesitation. He stated that there are currently no supply problems with oil or natural gas, either in the United States or in Europe.
Wait, hold on. If oil is at a 4-year high, sitting above $100 a barrel, and everyday economies are bracing for the pain at the pump, why on earth are the G7 and the IEA sitting on their hands? Are they just playing chicken with the market?
It looks counterintuitive, I know, but it is actually a highly calculated risk based on the primary function of those strategic reserves. Lescure's point highlights a critical disconnect in the market right now. The price of oil is reacting to fear, speculation, and the anticipation of future strikes.
The vibes, basically.
Right, the terrifying vibes. But the actual physical supply of oil, the tankers arriving at European and American ports, hasn't actually dried up yet. The fuel is still flowing. Strategic reserves were built to replace physical barrels when pipelines are blown up or shipping lanes are completely blockaded, not just to fight off price spikes driven by Wall Street panic.
So they're keeping their powder dry. They are terrified of emptying their emergency tanks to fight a price war today, only to find themselves with absolutely no reserves next month if an actual physical blockade happens in the Gulf.
Precisely. If you blow through your strategic reserves now and the conflict escalates further, destroying major production hubs, you have no safety net left.
But the panic driving that price isn't just based on abstract fear. It is being fed by very real visuals coming out of the region. Axios reported on the specific strikes that hit Iranian fuel facilities, detailing an attack on the Chevron oil depot in Tehran. The images are described as huge plumes of thick black smoke rising into the sky.
And those images matter.
Yeah, when algorithmic trading bots and human traders see thick black smoke billowing from a major regional oil depot, the price is going to react violently, regardless of what the G7 says about current supply levels.
Visuals of burning energy infrastructure are incredibly potent, and those same visuals, the sheer scale of the destruction, are creating a very specific, acute dilemma inside Washington right now. According to people familiar with the matter, the Trump administration was aware that Israel planned to target some depots. However, the scope of the attacks and those massive smoke plumes have actually prompted concern inside the administration and among the president's allies.
So what does this all mean? It means we are seeing a fascinating split screen in how this crisis is being handled politically in the United States. On one side, you have President Trump projecting a very calm, almost nonchalant posture regarding the rising oil prices. He posted on Monday that prices would fall quickly when the war is over, suggesting he believes the market will naturally self-correct once the kinetic phase of this conflict concludes.
But behind the scenes, some of his advisors are looking at that $100 a barrel price tag and feeling acute political peril. They understand the fundamental rule of domestic politics. Regardless of your foreign policy victories or the strategic necessity of a military campaign, high fuel costs are a massive domestic vulnerability.
Yeah, it's the one thing everyone notices.
Exactly. Voters feel the pain of a geopolitical crisis every single time they fill up their cars.
That tension between supporting a massive military campaign against an adversary and managing the domestic economic fallout is bringing out some very nuanced perspectives, specifically from GOP Senator Lindsey Graham. And his statements are really worth digging into because he is generally known as perhaps the most staunch supporter in Washington of U.S. military action against Iran.
He is usually the first to advocate for maximum pressure. He posted a message on X that started exactly how you would expect, praising Israel. He stated they have shown amazing capability when it comes to collapsing the murderous regime and that America is appreciative. But then he made a very interesting pivot. He urged caution about target selection.
He did. And his reasoning wasn't based on de-escalation for the sake of peace. It was entirely focused on the long-term endgame. Graham wrote that the ultimate goal is to liberate the Iranian people so they can be in charge of their own fate. He argued that to achieve this, Israel must be cautious not to cripple the country's chances to start a new life when the regime ultimately collapses. And the vital component to that new life, the Iranian oil economy.
It is a deeply strategic argument about what analysts call day-after planning. You can collapse a leadership structure with airstrikes, but you cannot liberate a population and hand them the ashes of their own infrastructure.
Right, what does this have to do with that?
Exactly. If you destroy the entire energy grid and all the oil export terminals, you inherit a collapsed state with tens of millions of impoverished citizens and zero economic engine to rebuild. Graham is showing an awareness that the morning after the conflict ends, the economic reality of the country has to be viable, or you just breed the next generation of extremism.
It's the ultimate tightrope walk. You have to hit them hard enough to break the regime, but leave enough of the plumbing intact so the country can actually function when the dust settles. And while we were talking about Washington's maneuvers, there was a brief, almost bizarre sidebar regarding diplomatic travel that highlights the shifting chaos of the moment. There were reports over the weekend that the president's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, were planning to visit Israel in the coming days.
Diplomatic travel during a kinetic war is always a logistical and security nightmare, but it is also a massive signaling tool. Sending high-level envoys usually signals a push for a ceasefire or a major strategic coordination.
Right, but then the White House officially clarified on Monday that the pair would not be going. The reporting notes it is entirely unclear if that trip was ever firmly on the books to begin with. It might just be noise, but it adds another layer to the shifting, somewhat chaotic diplomatic picture. Nobody quite knows what the exact next step is.
And all of this, the chaotic diplomatic signaling, the agonizing over the global oil supply, the military strikes, and the debates over target selection, it is all converging on one man. A man who has just been thrust into the very center of this storm. To truly understand why deterrence is failing and why this escalation feels so unpredictable, we have to look at the massive shift inside Iran itself.
This is where the story shifts from military hardware and oil markets to the psychology of leadership. Iran has a newly named supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the previous leader, Ali Khamenei. And the external pressure bearing down on him was immediate and intense. President Trump has already publicly called Mojtaba an unacceptable choice. Furthermore, Israel has explicitly vowed to target any successor.
What's fascinating here is the sheer velocity of the threats facing this new leader. He hasn't even had a moment to consolidate power before being placed under an existential microscope. To understand the gravity of his position, we have insights from two prominent analysts, CNN's Charlotte Reck and Karim Sajjadpour, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
Sajjadpour's assessment is incredibly blunt. He stated that Mojtaba is inheriting a terrible situation from his father. And the immediate reality of that terrible situation is that the new supreme leader of a major regional power is likely hiding underground right now, simply trying to elude assassination from day one of his tenure.
Imagine the paranoia and the operational bottlenecks of trying to run a country in a multi-front war from a bunker. Sajjadpour described Mojtaba's current reality as fighting a three-front war. And this framing is essential to understanding why the regime is acting with such aggressive fragility right now.
Let's break those three fronts down, because it really paints a picture of a regime backed into a corner.
First, he is fighting America, the greatest superpower in the world, which is actively sanctioning his economy and projecting naval power off his coast. Second, he is fighting Israel, described by Sajjadpour as the greatest military power in the Middle East, which is currently flying wide-scale waves of strikes against his infrastructure. And third, and arguably the most dangerous for the regime's long-term survival, he is fighting his own population.
That domestic front is critical. We often look at nations as monoliths, but Mojtaba has to actively quash anti-regime defiance at home while simultaneously managing these massive external wars.
Exactly. When a regime is pouring billions into regional proxy wars while its own citizens are suffering from crippling inflation and strict internal repression, the domestic resentment boils over. He has to dedicate massive amounts of security resources just to police his own streets, ensuring that the external pressure from U.S. and Israeli strikes doesn't serve as the catalyst for a total domestic uprising.
It is a balancing act that seems mathematically impossible to sustain over the long term. But Mojtaba Khamenei is not operating in a vacuum. He didn't just stumble into this role. Sajjad points out that there is a massive power structure behind the throne, specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC.
The role of the IRGC here cannot be overstated. When we say military, Western audiences usually think of the Army, Navy, or Air Force. The IOGC is entirely different. It is a parallel military structure designed specifically to protect the ideological purity of the regime. But beyond that, they are a massive corporate conglomerate. They control vast sectors of the Iranian economy, telecoms, construction companies, energy exports.
So when Israel is hitting regime infrastructure, they aren't just hitting military bases. They are essentially destroying the IRGC's corporate portfolio. And Sajjad specifically referenced a former IRGC intelligence chief named Hossein Taib, noting him as an ideologically aligned ally of the new supreme leader.
The fact that Mojtaba is so tightly aligned with figures like Taib and the broader intelligence apparatus of the IRGC tells us exactly what kind of government this is shaping up to be. They aren't looking to reform or open up to the West to relieve the economic pressure. Sajjad used a phrase to describe their ultimate vision for the country that should make every global leader sit up and take notice. He said their vision for Iran is essentially a Shiite North Korea.
A Shiite North Korea. Let's really think about what that comparison means, based on the analyst's description. Sajjad defined this vision with three chilling phrases. A government which is deeply repressive, deeply ideological, and deeply militarized.
North Korea is the ultimate geopolitical hermit kingdom. It survives by completely cutting its population off from the outside world, enforcing absolute ideological loyalty, and dedicating nearly all of its resources to militarization, specifically nuclear militarization, to deter outside intervention. When analysts suggest the IRGC and Mojtaba want a Shiite North Korea, they are suggesting a regime that is actively choosing permanent isolation. They do not care about integrating into the global banking system or having normalized diplomatic relations. They want a closed loop where internal control is absolute, enforced by a massive military apparatus.
And this brings us directly to the personality of the new leader himself. If you are going to build a hermit kingdom, you need a very specific type of leader. Sajjad noted that Mojtaba is described as dogmatic, very much in the mold of his father. But he went one step further, describing this dogmatic mindset as being willing to die a martyr rather than compromise.
That is the crux of why traditional deterrence is currently failing. Western diplomacy and military strategy are largely based on a rational actor model. The assumption is that if you apply enough economic sanctions, like the force majeure in Bahrain or the collapsing oil revenues, or if you apply enough kinetic force, destroying depots and bases, the adversary will eventually calculate that the cost of continuing the conflict is too high, and they will compromise.
But if your adversary views martyrdom as a valid, even preferable outcome compared to concede and defeat, then that entire calculus falls apart. Compromise isn't seen as a diplomatic necessity. It is seen as a spiritual and ideological failure.
Exactly. You cannot deter someone with the threat of destruction if they believe that destruction in the service of their ideology is a righteous end in itself. That mindset completely neuters the standard levers of international pressure. It is why the G7 can meet all day in Brussels and Israel can fly wave after wave of strikes, but the regime might simply absorb the punishment, retreat further underground, and tighten the screws on its own population to achieve that Shiite North Korea vision.
Which brings us to the synthesis of all these incredibly moving parts. For you listening right now, it might seem like the elevation of a new supreme leader hiding in a bunker thousands of miles away is a completely separate issue from what you will pay at the gas pump tomorrow, or the safety of global supply chains. But what we've unpacked today shows that these events form a tightly woven, incredibly volatile knot.
It is an unbroken chain of cause and effect. The ideological rigidity of a new leader relying on the IRGC provokes military strikes against Iranian infrastructure. Those strikes lead to burning oil depots and airspace violations. Those burning depots and the fear of further escalation lead to panic in the global markets and force majeure declarations from neighboring nations. That panic pushes oil past $100 a barrel, triggering emergency meetings among the world's top financial ministers and causing acute political headaches for leaders in Washington.
It is a massive geopolitical reaction,
Yeah.
and the links are firmly connected. Every time a missile is intercepted over a NATO ally or a barrel of oil ticks up another dollar, it traces back to that bunker in Iran. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with something to ponder on your own. We've talked extensively about the economic levers the West is trying to pull, monitoring reserves and navigating $100 oil, and we've detailed the immense military force being applied to the ground game. But let's look back at that psychological profile of the new supreme leader.
If Mojtaba Khamenei is truly as dogmatic as analysts suggest, if he and the massive apparatus of the IRGC are actively working toward a deeply isolated, heavily militarized Shiite North Korea, and they are genuinely willing to die as martyrs to achieve that vision.
Then the lingering question is this: how effective can traditional economic pressure, or even targeted infrastructure strikes, really be against a regime that might actually welcome its own physical destruction over the prospect of political compromise? It is a question that the financial markets, global militaries, and world leaders are going to have to answer very soon because the old rulebooks clearly aren't working.
The traditional tools of statecraft and deterrence simply might not apply to a leadership that operates on a completely different psychological wavelength.
We hope this deep dive helped clear the smoke a bit and connected the dots between the breaking news and the bigger picture. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the underlying mechanisms, and stay curious. We will catch you on the next one.